Hello and welcome to Professor Rasmussen, Chapter 8, Memory Errors. This is the third and final frontier for long-term memory. We're going to talk about memory errors in respect to long-term memory, and we're going to start off with memory errors that are basically related to information that you, as an individual, have experienced. So this entire talk is going to be about memory errors, problems with your memory, about your life, or about one's life, so personal memories. So what are personal memories called? Well, those personal memories are called autobiographical memory. Now there's a lot of ways to define autobiographical memory, and some researchers just claim it to be episodic in nature. However, many researchers also claim that it is episodic and semantic knowledge that is related to one's life, and that's the definition that I'm going to use, the episodic and semantic knowledge related to one's life. So, for instance, episodic would be, autobiographical would be the information of episodic, where you've experienced something that's very personally relevant. The semantic aspect of this would be information, again, that's very important to you, who you are as a person. So, solid examples here would be episodic, would be, I'm not sure, maybe experiences with your grandparents, possibly maybe something that defines you is times you've stood up for yourself in the world, so on and so forth. Semantic knowledge would be, knowledge about who you are as a person, your name, some of the information that you may have learned about yourself or about others. So this is autobiographical in nature. It's just a way to describe aspects that are related to you and kind of help make who you are as a person. And so we're going to talk about some autobiographical memories, things that you've definitely experienced and that you can be aware of. So let's get talking about it. So which autobiographical memories are recalled the most? What do you think? So maybe recall some of them, actually. Recall some of your autobiographical memories. Okay, so pause it and then do that now. I'm not going to wait 3 minutes with dead silence. You can pause it. Alright, so a lot of times what researchers find is that participants comment on aspects that have happened during adolescence as well as young adulthood. Okay, what researchers can kind of map out is no matter what time period the individual, even 60-year-olds, 70-year-olds, 40-year-olds, 30-year-olds, so on and so forth, they're going to typically pick up on they're going to start to find that people typically start to, or comment on most things that have happened during the age of 20, give or take about 5 years. Okay, so what researchers have found is that this is noted as the reminiscence bump. There's kind of like a dip later on during the mid-30s and mid-40s. So, woohoo! Look what I got to go. Some boring times ahead, non-memorable times. And that's possible. So why is this, though? Why is there this reminiscence bump? Okay, and these are for 55-year-olds' memory. Okay, so, well, overall, what researchers have noted is that this is a time when an individual may be forming their self-image, during the 20s, really becoming who they are going to be later in life. So it's a time of, great change. There also could be better encoding during this change, this actual period of life, or this change in an individual. And there's also a lot of firsts that an individual experiences. So during this period of time, during the adolescence, probably a first kiss, maybe first romantic relationship, you're going to likely remember, first time going away to school, first parties, first time, experimenting on drugs, potentially. So a lot of things that are happening during your firsts, or a lot of times your firsts are happening during these years here. Maybe your first child, maybe your first house you purchased, so on and so forth. First car, first apartment. Alright, so there could be a lot of firsts that are going on here where those are going to be remembered. Typically the first thing is remembered, but then all of the rest are kind of they could be remembered, but then they're all kind of just grouped together, and they're not as remembered as well as the first experience that you've had. Everything is kind of compared to it and possibly made into some sort of schema, essentially. Alright, so this is the reminiscence bump, and this is oftentimes what is remembered the most. Now, if you ask an individual about their past, the interesting thing is they typically comment that the past was more positive than what it really was. This is noted as the positive bias, rosy retrospection, nostalgia, and or rose-tinted glasses, as you can see there. The past was rose-tinted, as though the individual is wearing rose-tinted glasses, thus making, thus showing that people oftentimes remember the past as more good than what it was. So, interesting stuff. Here's some research on it. After vacations, people recount the vacation oftentimes as more positive than in reality. So while the individual is doing it, it was fun. However, after the vacation, it was typically more positive than when the individual was actually on vacation. So kind of interesting stuff here. There's a lot of more research that goes into this as well. But also, individuals later on in life, they oftentimes think their grades were better when they were in college. One thing that I kind of think about too is that, just as a personal experience here, I always thought that I took a lot of classes in college, and I did. I took many semester hours. I graduated with my Bachelor of Science with a plethora of additional credit hours. But I remember I thought like I would take like I was taking like in my mid 20s. I thought, man, I think when I was in college I was taking like 23 credit hours a semester, 24 credit hours a semester. And then I actually went back and looked when I was like 25 or 26, and sure enough I was not taking that many credit hours. I mean, I was taking a lot, but it wasn't nowhere near as many credit hours as I thought it was. So, even there, it happens to cognitive psychologists where believe that they were better than potentially what they were. So this is, one aspect in respect to, the rosy retrospection of the past. Okay, let's move on. So if we're looking at, this sometimes comes up with individuals. I believe people call this the Mandela effect. And so which one is the correct spelling? Yeah, most people say, I don't know, the one on the right, the one on the left. All right, well, typically people get this wrong. And if you want to know the correct answer to it, you probably do. But you can go to the internet, you can actually search for the correct answer, because I know this is probably going to be killing you now, but the Berenstain Bears. So why do people fail to remember what the Berenstain Bears is? And why do people oftentimes actually get this answer incorrect? Well, again, this is the Mandela effect. People typically have problems with memory in respect to some sort of particular image or particular saying. They oftentimes get some of these wrong. So, what is this? What is the cause for this? Well, some say this is some sort of alternative world, or maybe it's in collective unconscious where everyone is sharing the same unconscious of what and how you spell Berenstain Bears. Well, from a cognitive psychology perspective, no. What's happening here is you're failing to encode this information. Okay? You're simply failing to encode how specific the specific spelling for the Berenstain Bears actually is. Furthermore, what you are doing is you're encoding how it sounds as opposed to the spelling. All right, so you remember the Berenstain Bears, and you're not encoding the spelling, you're encoding how it sounds, and even how it sounds may actually trick you in respect to what the actual spelling is. So it's not some sort of alternative world. It's not some sort of collective unconscious. It's more than likely simple cognitive psychology effects that are occurring in respect to failure to encode. And then even if you do encode, you're encoding in the way that you say the word, the pronunciation, as opposed to the spelling. Okay? So, funny stuff here. You can Google the Mandela effect. But it's really just a failure to encode. But people love to put spins on these things. But there's a lot of totally cool pictures that do seem to fall victim to this failure to encode. All right, so let's continue on here because this is cognitive psychology, also mixing it up with the neuroscience here. So, in respect to what type of memories could be more encoded, I guess you can say, oftentimes emotional arousing information or experiences oftentimes benefit memory. So researchers typically find that individuals have an increased memory for pictures and words that are emotionally laden, so like sometimes violent images or emotional words like love, hate, violence, so on and so forth. So what researchers do find is oftentimes that there is an increase in activity within what's known as the limbic system, as well as the medial temporal lobe. Okay, so the limbic system oftentimes composed of at least the amygdala and the hippocampus. The entorhinal cortex is also an area surrounding the hippocampus, so you know that these areas are involved with memory. And what you can see is that all of these areas, when it's an emotional word, do have greater activity than just neutral words, suggesting that our brain may be possibly not necessarily pre-wired, however, one could potentially argue for that, but that it does take notice of information that is emotionally arousing. So, violent images, images of love, hate, so on and so forth, as well as even words that are involved with said emotions. Okay, so emotional arousing information is typically better remembered than non. Okay? And again, those are those many structures that are important for learning. Okay, so we're going to go on this last theme here, and a lot of this work involved flashbulb memory. Okay, so this is getting to the flashbulb memory. So many of you probably don't remember anything that happened September 12th, 2001. You probably don't even remember anything that happened September 11th, 2001. However, if you are one of those persons or people that did experience 2001 and you were old enough to experience it, please write down some things that you remember from September 12th versus September 11th. Okay, pause it and do that now. Okay, so if you don't remember what happened on September 11th, 2001, well, then you need to you need to do something with yourself here, okay? It's called open a history book or just Google this, okay? But as you remember, I mean, I'm not even sure what the statistic would be. I would be actually kind of curious about this. But on September 11th, 2001, uh, you know, there were four planes that crashed into the United States of America. Two crashed into the World Trade Center, both of the buildings, the large buildings in New York City. One crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and another plane crashed into a field in Pennsylvania. Now, those were the events that transpired on September 11th, 2001. Now, what happened on 2001, September 12th? Well, that's for you to talk about, okay? Now, what I'm trying to do here is that, if you're around on September 12th or September 11th and you remember these events, which one do you have more information for? Yeah, for sure, probably September 11th. You probably don't have anything from September 12th, more than likely. So, September 11th, what's going on? Well, this is likely a flash bulb memory. So, me personally, I can remember where I was, not what I was wearing, but who told me what had happened from September 11th, 2001. I was in a math class. Actually, I don't know if it was a math class now. I think it was a math class. It could also have been a physical geography class. But a student came in, told me that something had happened. He heard on the radio he was late to class. He heard on the radio that a plane crashed into one of the towers in New York. And I was like, oh, wow, that's really terrible. I'm sure it's just one of those small planes, because earlier in New York, a plane had actually accidentally hit the Empire State Building. So I was like, oh, wow, who could do that? Like, that's terrible. And so I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. But, got back to class and everything. And after class was over, I remember trying to turn on one of the TVs in the hallway, and it didn't go on. So I went down and I was like, oh, okay, maybe we'll try to check this out, on in the cafe. So I went down to the cafe, and there was a lot of people watching, gathering around. I was like, whoa, this must be big. So I went in there, and that's when, I obviously had to have seen one of the buildings on fire. I'm not sure if the building, one of the World Trade Centers, already had come down by then. I'm almost positive that the second plane had hit the second tower. But then it's just, kind of as a blur. I remember being in there. A lot of people were talking about it, obviously. A lot of people were silent. People were taking pictures with, legit 35 millimeter cameras of the computer screen or of the TV monitor. It's kind of definitely surreal when you think about it back to then. Anyhow, thanks for listening to that. I feel as though I should give you guys some money for listening to me and talk about my situation. But anyhow, that is for the most part to me, it is a totally legit memory. Okay. However, was this memory way better than the stuff that happened on September 12th? Yeah, on September 12th, I probably was just sitting at home, thinking about what had happened, talking about it. I know my dad came home late that night. He was on the road. My mom was in Arizona, so she wasn't with us. She was with my grandparents, so I really don't remember what happened at all September 12th. Might have done some work around the house, something along those lines, because I know school was canceled, or maybe it was a Saturday. I don't remember which day of the week it was, but September 11th, I remember a lot of information in respect to where I acquired that memory. So that's what a flashbulb memory is. Okay, where you were when you experienced or found out about an event. Okay, so it's a memory of where you learned of an event. So oftentimes people, when they think about a flashbulb memory, one of the most stereotypical flashbulb memories is when JFK, the president, John F. Kennedy, was shot and killed when he was assassinated. So a lot of individuals say that they know where they were, who they were with, how they heard it, about the information from JFK's assassination. Okay, so researchers actually looked into this, Brown and Kulik. They found that participants could tell a lot of details about this flashbulb memory of where they were when JFK, when they found out that JFK was shot. A lot of times people say, the world kind of stood still. I remember who I was with, maybe even what I was wearing. A lot of details, okay? However, there's a massive problem to one of these earliest studies on flashbulb memory. What is that problem? There's no control group, and there's no control or no comparison. These researchers don't even know if these participants are telling the truth. All they know is these participants are coming up with a lot of details, okay? They didn't even compare, you know, people who remembered versus people who didn't. It was as though, oh wow, a lot of people can remember. How do we even know that's accurate? Okay, but people do come up with a lot of information, and that's kind of cool to know. But we don't know if this is necessarily accurate. So here's some research on flashbulb memories, and the data is kind of mixed. Okay, so let's talk about this right here. So from September 11th in 2001, this data was published in 2003, obviously after the events of September 11th. And what you're going to see is on the x-axis you have days after the event, and you're going to have the number of details that a person can provide. Okay, so what these researchers find is that the details after the event start to decrease with time for both flashbulb as well as everyday events that these people write down about. Okay, however, this weird thing is that the belief later on, at 224 days later, of how accurate a person's memory is, the memories for flashbulb memory are oftentimes believed to be more accurate than for memories for everyday life. So this creates a problem because in reality, the memories of September 11th, they've decreased at just the same rate as everyday belief or everyday experiences. But people think that much later on, their memory is better for the flashbulb memories, for these very traumatic incidents like September 11th, and not so good for the everyday belief or the everyday experiences. So people could be kind of tricked into thinking that they have a better memory than what they do. So kind of interesting stuff here. So this is a really nice piece of research that Davidson and colleagues tried to look at for September 11th. And what they did is they had these people in, I believe this was on September 11th, 2001, or very, very soon, short after. They had these people write cues regarding September 11th. Okay, they had these people generate their own cues and create cues about September 11th. They also had these individuals write cues regarding everyday events that these individuals experienced. 1 year later, there was a surprise recall task. Okay, and these participants then had to recall the memories that they had via the cues. Okay, so they wrote down a memory and then they would write down a cue, just like I said earlier, and these cues would have to help them try to recall the memory. And what the researchers found is those cues regarding September 11th were much more useful at promoting memory than the everyday event cues. So overall, people did seem to have a better memory of 9/11 memories as opposed to everyday events. Okay, so this is kind of cool because it's a nice piece of research that supports that, hey, maybe there is something along the lines of a flashbulb memory when tested in a surprise recall task and when using cues. So maybe there is flashbulb memory. Okay, so if in fact flashbulb memories are legit, There could be a few reasons why flashbulb memories actually occur. One of these is that they might be better encoded, at the time of encoding, so that these are less resistant to forgetting or easier to retrieve. So if you encode some information, you remember, as we said, in a deep or a very connected manner, you associate a lot of different topics or themes with this piece of information, it's more likely that you're going to be able to retrieve that piece of encoded information. A person could also rehearse the information more so, okay? So I remember after September 11th, I constantly thought about, how and where I was when I experienced the event, these things that went down, kind of relived it. Oftentimes people also relive a lot of times, a very traumatic event, like, say, a robbery or a car accident or a sexual assault. They're going to rehearse this in their head over and over many times, and that could also help encode this information. But remember, as we said earlier, rehearsal is kind of like that reconsolidation, and any time point that you re-access a memory, it's potentially open to disruptions as well as interference from competing information. So these errors oftentimes that a person can have is that an individual may have learned, they're incorporating into their autobiographical memory, the flashbulb memory, something that they learned from an alternative source. Maybe something they heard from the TV, they heard from a friend, and now they're putting that their, into their actual memory, even though it didn't happen. This is what's known as a source monitoring error. We will talk about this later, but source monitoring error is where you know the information, you just forget where you learned it from. Sometimes you learn the information and you actually misattribute where you learned it from. So you actually learned it from class, but you think you learned it from TV. Here, you learned it from the TV, but you actually thought that you watched it live on TV while the event was actually happening, but you learned it from a TV show that was, like maybe weeks later. Okay. So there you have it. Mistook the source of the memory. You also could incorporate information from a schema. So, one of your schemas might start to intrude in on respect to, what happens in a, tragic incident. For September 11th, it might have been, you called your grandma, okay? And why is that? Well, typically you do call your grandma when there's something that bad that happens, and so therefore you now incorporate later on that you called your grandma, even though you did not call your grandma. Okay, so those are just some of the things that can come into play during a flashbulb memory. All right, white screen, y'all. That means we're done and over with. So I really hope this has been helpful to understand that people do make memory errors, especially in respect to autobiographical memories, but even in respect to flashbulb memories that may seem at face value to be extremely, ingrained into the individual's brain and memory, but in reality, they also are open to change as well as forgetting. Okay, so thanks for tuning in to the first of multiple memory error talks. Thank you and have a great